is a special case of the anti-communist paradigm of history. In its basic formulation, the anti-communist paradigm frames the history of the last century upside down. The Western imperialist countries are supposedly democratic, free, stand for human rights. The former socialist bloc countries, especially the Stalin era Soviet Union, were supposedly dictatorships, totalitarian, unfree, against human rights. In reality, the opposite is the case. According to the anti-Stalin paradigm, Stalin was a bloodthirsty dictator who killed millions of Soviet citizens, engineered frame-ups against many communists, and committed innumerable crimes. This is all false. This paradigm is strictly enforced in the academic field of Soviet history, and through it into the intellectual and semi-popular media, and then into the popular mass media. According to the anti-Stalin paradigm, it is considered illegitimate, that is, outside the limits of respectable discussion, to disprove any crime of which Stalin has been accused. One example of this is an article by Professor Matthew Leno, that's Lenoe, titled, "Did Stalin Kill Kirov and Does It Matter?" It was published in the Journal of Modern History in 2002. Leno insists that it doesn't matter, because even though Stalin did not kill Kirov, Stalin was so evil that the fact that he was not guilty of killing this one man, Sergei Kirov, is insignificant. In his 2010 book, The Kirov Murder in Soviet History, the same Professor Leno spends almost a page and a half assuring his readers that, although he himself has concluded that Stalin did not murder Kirov, he, Leno, loves freedom and democracy and hates dictatorship so much that no one should think for a minute that he, Leno, is pro-Stalin. Something Leno is clearly afraid of, since he is violating the unwritten but universally understood anti-Stalin paradigm by stating that Stalin did not commit this particular crime. My own path to Soviet history. I want to explain briefly how I came to do research on the Stalin era in the Soviet Union. My story illustrates a number of important issues that I will discuss in more detail later. The influence of anti-communism, the need for objectivity in the search for truth, the utter bankruptcy of the profession of Soviet history, a corruption that even the best historians of this field cannot entirely escape. In 1967, while I was watching a demonstration against the Vietnam War in Manhattan, that's a part of New York City, a friend of mine remarked to me that he and I should be marching with the contingent that was passing by carrying the flag of the so-called Viet Cong, that is, the Vietnamese communists. At that moment, another onlooker, another spectator, told us that we should not oppose the American war in Vietnam. We asked him, why not? He replied, quote, because the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam is led and controlled by the Vietnamese Communist Party. The Vietnamese Communist Party is led by Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh had been trained by Joseph Stalin, and Stalin had killed 20 million people. This claim stuck in my mind. I did not believe it. I also did not disbelieve it. Instead, I resolved that someday, when I had completed my doctoral dissertation in medieval comparative literature and had a job, I would look into the questions about Joseph Stalin. A couple of years later, I bought and studied a copy of Robert Conquest's 1968 book, The Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s. I was shaken by what I read there. Page after page of accusations that Stalin had committed mass murder and other terrible crimes. So I decided that this is where I would begin to look into the accusations against Stalin, and by extension, against the Soviet Union of his time. I made a card file of every footnote in Conquest's huge book. Over a period of 3 years, I spent my spare time taking the bus from my apartment in New Jersey to the New York City Public Library with its magnificent Slavic collection. There I checked Conquest's footnotes. What I found was this. Conquest had no primary source evidence. He took any anti-Stalin fact claim from Khrushchev-era Soviet sources and from many other anti-communist sources, but none of these contained any evidence either. Conquest simply believed, that is, he proposed that his readers believe, that any statement made by virtually any writer, so long as it was hostile to Stalin, should be accepted as truthful. Not incidentally, Conquest used Leon Trotsky's autobiography, My Life, as one of his sources, and also Isaac Deutscher's flattering and dishonest biography of Trotsky. Conquest's book has more than 1,000 footnotes, but many of these were to anti-communist books that were reviewed critically, even negatively, by anti-communist reviewers at that time, and none of them contained any evidence either. I came to understand that all of the professional scholars of Soviet history who had reviewed Conquest's book positively were either deceiving themselves or each other, or were genuinely ignorant of what primary source evidence was. At that time, I did not understand that the anti-Stalin paradigm existed. I was first introduced to it in 1985. I had met a young scholar, you would recognize his name, who was one of the editors of Russian History, a scholarly journal still published today. At his suggestion, I drafted an article on the Tukhachevsky affair and sent it to him. The Tukhachevsky affair is the conspiracy of high-ranking Soviet military commanders against the Soviet government and in collaboration with the German High Command. In that article, I reviewed all the evidence that this was a frame-up by Stalin and concluded there was no evidence to support that conclusion. The young reviewer made me rewrite the article several times and also had it vetted, checked by other young scholars whom he knew. At length, he told me that it was ready for publication. At this point, the publisher of Russian history, Charles Schlocks, rejected the article. But Schlocks did not reject my article on academic grounds. Rather, he objected to it on the grounds that, quote, it made Stalin look good. Of course, my article did no such thing. The real reason he rejected it was that it failed to conclude that Stalin had framed, that is, falsely accused, Tukhachevsky and the rest. My article simply concluded, based on the evidence that was available in the early 1980s, that it was impossible to claim that Tukhachevsky was innocent. So I concluded that we just don't know. To his credit, the young scholar who had vetted my article insisted that it be published. He even threatened to resign from the editorial collective if the publisher did not publish it, because it had gone through the appropriate scholarly review. So my article was published, but in a strange way. The issue in which it appeared contained an introduction with a commentary paragraph about each article in that issue, except for my article. The introduction simply does not mention my article at all. This introduction was written by the same young scholar. Evidently, this omission reflected the fact that the publisher did not wish to publish my article and certainly did not want to draw attention to it. Ironically, the fact that only my article had no commentary paragraph has the effect of drawing attention to something important, the anti-Stalin paradigm. This was my first introduction to the anti-Stalin paradigm. For my second encounter with the anti-Stalin paradigm, we must fast forward to the year 2005. In that year, I published a two-part article in the online peer-reviewed journal Cultural Logic, titled, quote, Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform. You can download it from my homepage. When it was published, Alan Wald, a prominent American Trotskyite scholar, and therefore strongly biased against Stalin, resigned in protest from the editorial board of Cultural Logic, telling the other editors that my article should never have been published. The editors offered to publish a refutation or criticism by him of my article. But Wald refused to write one and simply repeated that my article should never have been published. My third encounter with the anti-Stalin paradigm occurred in 2018 when I published my book on the Katyn massacre. In that book, I show, from primary source evidence, that the Soviet Union could not possibly have shot the Polish prisoners of war in this massacre. I also expose the dishonesty of the only two major academic studies of the Katyn massacre. For some years, I had been a member of the H. Poland mailing list, one of the 100 or more academic mailing lists run by the University of Michigan and known as the HNet lists. This list has a monthly post listing new books relating to Polish history. I submitted my book to be included in this list. As a result, the moderator of the list expelled me from the list without explanation or appeal. This was in violation of the HNet guidelines, but the HNet managers refused to reinstate me on this list. Khrushchev lied. My first book, Khrushchev Lied, gives the evidence for my discovery that in Nikita Khrushchev's infamous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on February 25th, 1956, every allegation of crime against Stalin and against Lavrentiy Beria is demonstrably false. My book had been published in Russian in December 2007. Although it sold 13,000 copies, it attracted very little attention outside of Russia. The English language edition was published in February 2011. However, at that time, I did not fully understand the implications of the fact that Khrushchev had told nothing but lies about Stalin in that world-shaking secret speech. It took me some time to ask myself, why had Khrushchev told nothing but lies in that speech? Why had he not sprinkled some true crimes of Stalin in with the lies? The answer is clear to me today. Khrushchev knew of no genuine crimes of Stalin. Khrushchev's researchers could not find any evidence of even a single genuine crime of Stalin. For if they had, Khrushchev would certainly have included them in his secret speech. In October 1961, Khrushchev presided over the 22nd Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev's supporters attacked Stalin ferociously. Once again, those accusations, the ones I could check up on thanks to documents from formerly secret Soviet archives, are all false. After the 22nd Party Congress, Khrushchev and his men did two things. First, they sponsored a flood of pseudo-historical articles and books about Stalin's alleged crimes. I have checked many of these books and articles. None of them contain any primary source evidence. But why didn't these books contain any primary source evidence? Here is the reason why. In 1962, the Khrushchev regime held a conference for party historians, that is, historians of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. There, Pyotr Pospelov, one of Khrushchev's cronies, explicitly told them, that's the party historians, that access to documents in the Central Party archive was forbidden to them. Pospelov told the assembled party historians that instead of access to the party archives, they would have to refer to the Khrushchev-era textbook of party history and to the proceedings of the 22nd Party Congress. I gradually came to realize that the archives must not contain any evidence to support the Khrushchev-era accusations against Stalin. In fact, they must contain evidence to disprove Khrushchev's charges of crimes against Stalin. Otherwise, why would Khrushchev forbid these trusted party historians any access to those archives? The second thing Khrushchev did was to create a blue ribbon top-level commission under the chairmanship of Nikolai Shvernik, an old Bolshevik, to find evidence that the Tukhachevsky affair descendants and the Moscow trials defendants were innocent. This commission wrote two lengthy documents, known today as the Schwernik reports, one in 1962 to 63, the other in 1964. Neither of them was published until 1994, after the end of the Soviet Union. In these reports, the researchers tried hard to find evidence that the military commanders and Moscow trials defendants had been framed, that they were innocent victims of Stalin, but they were unable to do so. In fact, they found evidence to the contrary. In 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev, then the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, launched yet another sustained attack on Stalin. Like Khrushchev's, it was accompanied by a flood of pseudo-historical articles and books, often published in hundreds of thousands of copies. Gorbachev also drew upon materials from the Khrushchev era. I have studied many of the works sponsored by Gorbachev. None of them contain primary source evidence to support charges that Stalin committed any crimes. Here is one example. In 1988, the Soviet Supreme Court ruled that Nikolai Bukharin and a few other defendants in the third Moscow trial of March 1938 were innocent. The document containing the Supreme Court's ruling still remains classified in Russia today in 2024. In 2007, I discovered the full text of this Soviet Supreme Court ruling in the Volkogonov archive. These are documents from Soviet archives that had been exported from Russia in the early 1990s by General Dmitry Volkogonov, a ferocious enemy of Stalin and of communism, and a very close associate of Gorbachev and Yeltsin. In 2010, my Moscow-based colleague, Vladimir L. Bobrov, and I published in Russian an article showing that the Soviet Supreme Court had deliberately lied in their decision. In it, the Supreme Court judges quote from a 1939 confession by Mikhail Phrynovsky. Phrynovsky was Nikolai Yezhov's vice commissar, his right-hand man in the NKVD, and that's the Soviet political police. In 1988, Phrynovsky's confession was still secret. No one could see it. When it was finally published in 2006, we could see that in reality, Phrynovsky had testified that Bukharin was not innocent but guilty. I have now published 16 books in English exposing lies about Joseph Stalin. I would like to tell you briefly about the last three of them. In The Fraud of the Testament of Lenin, 2022, I showed that those documents written by Lenin between the end of December 1922 and March 1923 that are critical of Stalin are forgeries. In Stalin Exonerated, Fact-Checking the Death of Solomon Mikhoels, 2023, Vladimir Bobrov and I show that the story, accepted by all bourgeois scholars and of course by Trotskyites, that Stalin ordered the murder of Yiddish theater director Solomon Mikhoels in January 1948, is another case of forgery. In Trotsky's Comintern Conspiracy, 2024, this year, Vladimir and I show that the Comintern was riddled with Trotskyite conspirators, including Osip Chetnitsky, the former leader of the Comintern. In these, as in all my other books, I rely on primary source evidence. This raises the question, what is evidence? Many people, including many who consider themselves to be Marxist-Leninists, do not care about evidence. What they want is material that reinforces whatever their preconceived ideas and biases already are. This is the logical fallacy called confirmation bias. Persons who think like this are not interested in the truth. So, what is evidence? Primary source evidence, usually though not always documents, is the only valid evidence. What then is primary source evidence? It is evidence that is as close to the matter that you are investigating as you can get. Such evidence will be biased, since, like all evidence, It is created by human beings, and we all have biases. But it will only reflect the biases of its own time and place, as close to the matter under investigation as possible. Once you begin to insist on primary source evidence, it changes the way you think about everything. Primary source evidence does not have the biases of later periods. So, for example, primary source evidence produced in the 1930s is close in time to the Moscow trials. But statements, confessions, and so on about the Moscow trials produced during Nikita Khrushchev's time, 1956 to 1964, is not primary source evidence, because those statements will inevitably reflect the biases of Khrushchev's time. And in fact, we know that Khrushchev was soliciting, asking for false testimony against Stalin, just as Gorbachev did again later. Let me put this plainly with an example. For many years, the only primary source evidence we had about the Moscow trials of 1936 to 1938 was the trial transcripts themselves. All the evidence in these transcripts points towards the guilt of the accused. Many people at that time and since have denied that the accused were guilty, but they had no evidence that the Moscow trials were frame-ups. The only primary source evidence available was that of the trials transcripts. Therefore, since the only primary source evidence pointed unequivocally toward the guilt of the defendants, no one, either at that time or since then, was or is justified in drawing any other conclusion except this: on the evidence, the Moscow trials defendants were guilty. Consider the accusation that Leon Trotsky collaborated with the Nazis, Hitlerites. We have a great deal of evidence that Trotsky did collaborate with the Nazis and the Japanese and engaged in other crimes. We have no evidence that this evidence against Trotsky was fabricated or faked. Therefore, an objective assessment must be this: in the light of the fact that all the evidence we now have points towards Trotsky's guilt, objectivity demands that we conclude that Trotsky was guilty. If in future more primary source evidence is discovered that goes against this conclusion, we must be ready to revise our judgment or even to reverse it. That is, assuming we are interested in the truth. Trotsky, of course, denied his guilt, but to a serious seeker for historical truth, Trotsky's denials are of no interest. Why? Because we expect that both the guilty and the innocent will claim that they are innocent. There has never been any evidence that the Moscow trials were frame-ups. On the contrary, all the primary source evidence points towards their guilt. And now, from the former Soviet archives, we have an enormous amount of more primary source evidence of the guilt of the Moscow trials defendants. So there can be no doubt of it. The Moscow trials defendants were guilty of at least those crimes to which they confessed themselves guilty. Leon Trotsky did indeed collaborate with the Nazis, among other serious crimes. Yet a great many people believe that the Moscow trials defendants were innocent, framed by Stalin and the prosecution. They believe this in defiance of all the primary source evidence. They are accustomed to accepting the word of academic experts in many fields. So why not accept the word of academic experts in Soviet history? Also, they believe this because they do not understand what evidence is or how to use it. I'd like to say a word about confessions as evidence. Many people, including historians who should know better, assume that confessions are dubious or even invalid as evidence because they might have been obtained by violence or threats against either the prisoner or his relatives. Such people dismiss the evidence contained in confessions. Their reasoning goes something like this, and this is what many people think. As there is no material evidence, for example, documents where the conspirators outlined their conspiracy, perhaps even in the handwriting of the conspirators themselves, found in their homes, containing their signatures, etc. This means there is no evidence against the accused except for confessions by the accused or accusations in the confessions of other prisoners. But confessions can be faked, and we know that many were faked by the NKVD. Consequently, the accused must be considered innocent and the trial's a farce. End quote. Indeed, academic anti-communists frequently use the word farce in order to dismiss, for example, the three Moscow trials of 1936, 1937, and 1938. Those who use the word farce are evidently unaware that they are thereby admitting, perhaps unconsciously, that they have no evidence that the trials were fabrications. They just assume that they were. This reasoning is, of course, faulty. All evidence, documents, material objects such as books and photographs, testimony of any kind, can be faked. It is at least as difficult, and perhaps even more difficult, to convince experienced revolutionaries to falsely confess than to fabricate faked documents, complete with forged handwriting and signatures, or to create phony photographs. Any modern state in the 1930s as well as today possesses the technical means to create any kind of fake evidence that can be exposed as fake, if at all, only by destructive methods of examination, which are never permitted. In other words, confessions are no more or less subject to fakery than any other kind of evidence. What the historian must do in the case of confessions, as with any kind of evidence, is to study it carefully and compare it to the other evidence that exists in order to search for similarities and differences, contradictions and consistencies. In fact, the Soviet prosecution did provide so-called material evidence at the Moscow trials. At the first Moscow trial of August 1936, a passport was produced by the prosecution, page 89 of the transcript. At the second Moscow trial of January 1937, a notebook was produced by the prosecution, page 272. But anti-communists and Trotskyites simply ignore these facts. They know that very few people will read the more than 1,500 pages of trial transcripts and discover that, yes, in fact, there was indeed material evidence against the defendants. So how can we tell if a defendant was falsely convicted? The answer is we need to locate and study the evidence that the Soviet prosecution had at the defendant's trial. Khrushchev's and Gorbachev's men, quote, rehabilitated, end quote, the Moscow trials defendants and many others who had been executed during the 1930s and 1940s. Vladimir Bobrov and I have obtained and studied all the Khrushchev era and Gorbachev era rehabilitation reports we can find. We have never found even one that provided evidence, yet they are taken as proof of innocence by anti-communists and by Trotskyists. When it comes to historical evidence, there is no such thing as credibility. All evidence must be subjected to doubt and carefully studied. But there are also other barriers to discovering the truth. Let me say a few words about objectivity. Historian Michael Schudson has called objectivity, quote, an ideology of the distrust of the self. In order to put it into effect, to operationalize objectivity, therefore, we must make a sincere, determined, diligent attempt to minimize our own pre-existing biases and preconceived ideas. We must look with extra skepticism at any evidence or any account that tends to support our own bias. At the same time, we must give especially generous, sympathetic consideration to any evidence that tends to contradict our own bias. If we fail to do this, we will inevitably fall prey to confirmation bias, the tendency to regard with sympathy materials that support our own bias and to regard skeptically or even to reject evidence that tends to disprove our bias. If we do this, and this is by far the normal practice in the field of Soviet history of the Stalin period, not only will we never discover the truth, being blinded by our own biases, we will never even recognize the truth if by chance we happen to run across it. Bias can be overt or hidden, covert. The former, overt bias, is relatively easy to recognize. Most historiography of the Stalin period, to say nothing of media accounts, reeks of overt bias. When you are confronted by overt bias, you can safely ignore what is being said or what you are reading. There is no chance that it will be a truthful account because the author has not practiced objectivity. This disqualifies all the most famous academic experts, so-called, on Soviet history, all of them. It also disqualifies anything published by, for example, the Hoover Institution, as well as any book or article published by a fellow of the Hoover Institution, like Robert Conquest was or Stephen Kotkin is. Why? Because the Hoover is the largest and best funded anti-communist research institution in the world. It never, ever publishes anything that could be construed as pro-communist or pro-Stalin. Therefore, there is no chance that it will publish the truth. By the same token, you can discount anything published by an avowed Trotskyite. A Trotskyite historian has no incentive to tell the truth. He or she is constrained to come to anti-Stalin conclusions and support pro-Trotsky accounts, and so is not interested in questioning his own bias, that is, in being objective. In fact, insofar as a person is a Trotskyite, that person is not a Marxist. Why? Because Marxists are materialists. Materialists judge the truth or falsehood of fact claims, statements, on the basis of evidence, not of faith or belief. But Trotskyites have chosen to believe Trotsky and whatever he wrote, regardless of the evidence. Therefore, a Trotskyite historian can never come to truthful conclusions concerning the Stalin-era Soviet Union. The use of Soviet evidence. You sometimes hear the claim that, quote, Soviet evidence is tainted evidence. But this is false. Soviet primary sources are as useful as evidence as any other sources. Moreover, anti-Stalin and pro-Trotsky writers use Soviet evidence all the time. The late Vadim Z. Rogovin, the most famous Trotskyite historian of the Stalin period, used Soviet sources hundreds of times in his numerous books. It is invalid to argue that Soviet evidence is not valid when it tends, for example, to show that Trotsky was guilty of serious crimes and conspiracies, but somehow valid when it tends to show that Stalin was guilty of this or that crime. It is also invalid to argue, as many Trotskyites and anti-communists do, that, quote, Trotsky must be innocent of collaborating with the Germans because no evidence of this collaboration has turned up in the captured German archives. I have discussed this argument in detail in several of my books and in at least 3 of my podcasts recorded. See, for example, my book, New Evidence of Trotsky's Collaboration, 2020, on pages 22 to 24, for an extended discussion of this point. The bottom line is this. It is invalid to declare that Trotsky was innocent of collaboration with the Nazis because of evidence that is lacking, while ignoring the large amount of evidence of Trotsky's guilt that exists. A scientific principle states that, quote, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We must work with the evidence we have, and in the case of Trotsky's collaboration with the Germans, we have a great deal of it. Many dishonest writers rely on the fact that most of their readers do not know what evidence is or how to understand it. This is not surprising. Most people do not work with historical evidence, and so do not do historical research. Why would we expect that they should know what evidence is, what it is not, and how to use it? Sure enough, most people don't know. But many college-educated people, and especially people with advanced degrees, assume that somehow they do know how to use historical evidence, even though they have never given this question any serious thought and have never been trained in using it. Such persons are especially easy to fool with fallacious arguments. One aspect of the general ignorance about how to identify and use evidence, remember, primary source evidence is the only valid evidence, is the general ignorance of logical fallacies. that is, errors in informal logic. There are some good Wikipedia pages on these issues: informal fallacy, list of fallacies, informal logic. Here are some of the most common fallacies that I see all the time in persons who write me, as well as in persons who wish to criticize my work, and also in the work of anti-communist historians. Confirmation bias, ad hominem argument, for example, name calling. Furr is a Stalinist, and therefore we can ignore what he says. Appeals to authority, other experts. Begging the question, that is, assuming that which is to be proven. Argument from incredulity. I can't believe that, therefore it isn't true, or therefore it is less likely to be true. Argument from repetition. You hear a fact claimed so often from so many different sources that you feel there must be at least some truth to it. This is sometimes called where there's smoke, there must be fire. Association fallacy. Quote, Grover Furr is a Stalinist. Also an example of an ad hominem argument, name calling. So there's no need to read his research because Stalinists are wrong. Guilt by association is another version of this. Argument from motive. Quote, Furr wants to find Stalin blameless of any crime, therefore you can dismiss whatever he writes. Bandwagon. All the experts say it, appeal to authority, so we can be pretty sure it's true. Red herring. In the first Moscow trial, defendant Goltzman claimed that in November 1932, he met Trotsky's son Leon Sedov in a Copenhagen hotel and then went to visit Trotsky. The red herring is the evidence that he could not have met Sedov since Sedov was not there. But that doesn't mean that he didn't meet Trotsky. Shifting the burden of proof. It is up to Furr, or whoever, to explain why there's no evidence of Trotsky's conspiracy with the Germans and Japanese in the German and Japanese archives, instead of dealing with the mounds of Soviet evidence that Trotsky did collaborate. Argument from consequences. If Furr is correct that Trotsky collaborated with the Germans and Japanese, then the whole Trotskyite movement for the past 90 years is a delusion. This is unacceptable because, to Trotskyites and anti-communists, that would be so terrible that it just can't be true. Now, why do many people think Stalin was a criminal? The short answer is, for the same reason that many people think communism is bad, and the communist movement was bad. Anti-communist, anti-Stalin propaganda. After the Russian Revolution, the field of Soviet studies was established to provide ammunition in the form of academic-sounding falsehoods to political anti-communism. It was never primarily about discovering the truth about the Soviet Union. Leon Trotsky's lies about Stalin, and they are lies, as I have shown in several of my books, had a limited, though important, circulation on the non-communist and anti-communist left. The Cold War caused an increase in anti-communist propaganda, of course. But Nikita Khrushchev's infamous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress in February 1956 was a body blow to the world communist movement from which it never recovered. In it, Khrushchev described Stalin as a criminal, much as Trotsky had done. In fact, it appears that Khrushchev may have taken some of his lies from Trotsky's writings, though of course without attributing them to Trotsky. Under Khrushchev, the 22nd Party Congress in October 1961 witnessed an orgy of anti-Stalin lies and accusations. Afterwards, Khrushchev sponsored a flood of articles and books accusing Stalin of all manner of heinous crimes. None of these works contained any evidence, for remember, only primary sources are valid evidence. I've already mentioned the fact that in 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev launched an attack on Stalin and the Stalin era, even larger and more vicious than that of Khrushchev, some of whose lies Gorbachev recycled. In the post-Soviet period, scholars of Soviet history continue to repeat the lies of the Khrushchev and Gorbachev periods, none of which are supported by primary source evidence, and to invent even more crimes, equally without evidence to support these accusations. A word or two about the big lie. This is the background for what is called, after Adolf Hitler, the big lie. Here are two quotations from Hitler's autobiography, My Struggle, also known by its German title as Mein Kampf. Quote, The aim of propaganda is not to pass judgment on conflicting rights, giving each its due, but exclusively to emphasize the right which we are asserting. Quote again, propaganda must not investigate the truth objectively, and insofar as it is favorable to the other side, present it according to the theoretical rules of justice. It must present only that aspect of the truth which is favorable to its own side. And one last quotation from Hitler, because it's practiced so often in the capitalist media and by capitalist scholars. Quote Hitler again. All this was inspired by the principle, which is quite true in itself, that in the big lie there is always a certain force of credibility. This is because the broad masses often tell small lies in little matters, but would be ashamed to resort to large-scale falsehoods. It would never come into their heads to fabricate colossal untruths. Therefore, they would not believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so famously. For the grossly impudent lie always leaves traces behind it, even after it has been nailed down, a fact which is known to all expert liars in this world, and to all those who conspire together in the art of lying. End quote. Hitler was writing about the broad masses and about mass propaganda, but the same principle works with more educated persons, as long as the big lies are wrapped up in academic packaging. Many, if not most, educated persons are simply unwilling to believe that so many professional, famous, respected academic historians could possibly be promoting falsehoods, claims of crime by Stalin or the Soviet Union of the Stalin period, which cannot be supported by evidence. They are much more likely to think that the person, myself, for example, who tell them this is lying. Such a belief is comforting because it suggests that, for example, myself, Grover Furr, can be ignored. Whereas if the former were taken seriously, the consequences for our whole way of understanding Soviet history during Stalin's time, and in fact, of understanding world history, would be shaken or even dismantled. This is the fallacy called argument from consequences. The consequences of learning and accepting that Soviet history has been so completely falsified appear to be so serious that it is far easier, because non-threatening, to dismiss anyone who shows this to be true. This then is the big lie and how it works. And it works very well. Propaganda does work. Hitler was commenting on the effectiveness of Allied propaganda in the First World War, which he recognized had used the big lie technique, while Imperial Germany should have used it far more than Hitler thought it did. Western journalists, too, commented at that time on the extent of lying by the Allied mass media during the First World War. The importance of these facts. The question of Stalin is the most important question facing workers, students, and intellectuals worldwide who are striving to get rid of capitalism. The big lie is that Joseph Stalin was a mass murderer who framed on false charges and killed a great many loyal communists and millions of other Soviet citizens. The big lie is not only taken for granted as true, it is taboo to question it, forbidden to question it, first in the academic field of Soviet history itself, and then in the semi-popular, popular, and mass media. The experts, so-called, all claim that Stalin was a mass murderer. The media cannot and do not do independent research on their own. They are not equipped to do it. So they repeat what the experts say. The Trotskyite cult around the world echoes these lies. In this way, they are smuggled directly into the left movements, socialist and communist worldwide. This is the anti-Stalin paradigm. Anti-Stalinism is the main form that anti-communism takes in the world today. Anti-Stalinism is employed to discredit anyone who is struggling for a better world. As an example of this, I cite a debate that I participated in October 2012 against a conservative and a libertarian. The libertarian was a Soviet immigrant who had left the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and was teaching at Hillsdale College, a private right-wing college in the Midwest of the United States. In my presentation, I told the student audience that they should have free higher education. The libertarian replied that any involvement of the government in your lives puts you on the slippery slope to communism, and Stalin killed 40 million people. That's what he said. This is the kind of stuff we are all facing. Republicans in the United States, called mild social democrats, and even mainstream members of the Democratic Party, communists. Forget about social reforms of any kind. These billionaires and their hired flunkies want to make us completely dependent on private employers. What a bonanza for the capitalists. It is important that you, face the facts. All of us are under attack by the lies against Stalin. Now, what must we do about this? It is up to us to do whatever we can to counter and then to roll back this avalanche of lies about Stalin, the Soviet Union, and the communist movement during his time. Here is one outline of a program of action that every one of us here can participate in. 1. Study. We must educate ourselves. Study to understand what primary source evidence is. Study in order to recognize logical fallacies. Study what we know about the Stalin period now. My books are a good place to do this. That's why I'm here speaking to you today. Time prevents me from even a brief discussion of all my books and articles, in which I, with my colleagues, examine and disprove the allegations of crimes against Joseph Stalin. You may find a list of my books and links to my articles on my homepage. That's study. 2, spread the word. Through social media, through posts on mailing lists, through talking to your political comrades and colleagues, through participating in study groups, debates, and discussions. 3, challenge anti-Stalin, anti-communist lies wherever you encounter them. Write a letter to the editor every time you see a lie about Stalin in some article. Write for newspapers, journals, and web pages. Write reviews, especially reviews of my books. Remember, the world's greatest expert on Stalin and the Soviet Union during his time, Stephen Kotkin of Princeton University and the Hoover Institution, wrote a book in which every single allegation of crime or even minor misdeed by Stalin is provably, demonstrably false. Every single one. I demonstrate this thoroughly in my book, Stalin, Waiting for the Truth. If Stephen Kotkin could not find even a single real, provable crime of Stalin, it has to be because, like Khrushchev and like Gorbachev, he couldn't find evidence of even one of them. So in order not to violate the anti-Stalin paradigm, he had to falsify and lie. 4, never be afraid to say, I don't know. No one can know everything. And it's important to be honest, first of all, with yourself and with each other. Whenever you hear some allegation of a crime of Stalin, you can check my books and articles to learn whether that allegation has been disproven. If it has not, then say this, something like this. Quote, I don't know, but there is no reason to believe anti-communists or Trotskyists because they have no incentive to tell the truth and every reason to ignore the truth and to lie. And then you should recommend my research and study it yourself. Finally, the most important reason. Yes, it's vitally important to establish the truth about Stalin and the first worker state, the Soviet Union, in order to refute the anti-communist lie that, quote, communism leads to massive crimes and mass murder. But there is another reason. We need to understand why the Soviet Union did not build socialism and then go on to develop in a more and more egalitarian and democratic manner towards communism. This was certainly the goal of Lenin and Stalin, of millions of working people in the Soviet Union, and of hundreds of millions of working people around the world who looked to Stalin with hope. In 2005, I published an article entitled Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform that you can download. I mentioned it earlier. Now we have, from the former Soviet archives, the text of a draft of the proposed party program for 1947, which calls for much more democratic control by the population and much less reliance on compulsion of all kinds. This fascinating document has only been available for a few years and has not yet been discussed in the field of Soviet studies. I hope to talk about it, perhaps write about it at a future time. We can never learn the lessons that the history of this, the first workers' state, has to teach us if we are blinded by lies. The only way we can learn what the Soviet Union under Lenin and Stalin did that was right, correct, and what they did that turned out to be wrong and incorrect, leading not to communism, but back towards capitalism. The only way we can hope to learn these lessons is if we are in possession of the truth about Soviet history. The capitalists, of course, have already drawn their lessons from their false history of the Stalin era Soviet Union. The lesson they want us to believe is that the overthrow of capitalism through communist revolution will lead to dictatorship, mass murder, and a worse world even than the capitalist world. This is all false. So first we must prove to ourselves and to others that it is false. Then we must convince others that it is false. But we can't stop there. We have to go on to study both what it is that the Bolsheviks did that we should imitate and what errors the Bolsheviks committed that led them off the road to communism and that the communist movements of the future must learn from and avoid. Therefore, it is vital that we study the Soviet experience. If we fail to do this, at best, we run the danger of making the same mistakes the Soviets did and ending up back at capitalism, like what happened in the Soviet Union and today's Russia. In his book, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, Karl Marx wrote, quote, this is Marx, Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historical facts and personages appear, so to speak, twice. He forgot to add, the first time is tragedy, the second time is farce. The international communist movement of the 20th century during the time of Lenin and Stalin won many world-shaking triumphs. The tragedy of the international communist movement of the 20th century was that ultimately it failed. Unless we figured out where they went wrong, then we are doomed to be the farce, and that would be a crime, our crime. So we have to look with a critical eye at all of our legacy. Karl Marx's favorite saying was, De omnibus dubitandum, question everything. Marx would be the last person in the world to exclude himself from this questioning. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. And now we are moving to the second part of the program, and it's the interaction. So, if anybody has any questions, they can raise their hand or uh, paste their or send their questions to the message chat. And before that, I would like to ask a question too. So, like, how much do you think that uh, the informations, the misinformations led by the Khrushchev, previously by Trotsky, contributed to the downfall of the communist movement in the all worldwide?
Could you just repeat that more slowly? I didn't catch everything.
How much of the effect do you think the misinformation and the lies that were distributed throughout the world affected
Yeah,
the global movement?
yeah. You're asking me what's the question?
Yeah, how much of the lies do you think contributed to the fall of the movement, revolution?
Well, I'm not sure I understand your question completely, but let me say this. Uh, we don't know. I think it still needs to be determined precisely why Khrushchev uh, attacked Stalin. And his attack on Stalin started before the 1950s, his famous secret speech of February 1956 at the 20th Party Congress. We have enough primary source information now from former Soviet archives to know that Khrushchev was planning this well in advance. We don't know why he did that. We can guess, we can speculate that Khrushchev and many, if not most, of his followers, oh, excuse me, I don't know what to do here. Let me just try to get there. We can speculate that many of Khrushchev's supporters and Khrushchev himself disagreed with the political um, line of the communist movement, which is to fight for communist revolution, because Khrushchev's most famous uh, slogan, if you want, was for victory in peaceful competition with capitalism. Khrushchev uh, said that revolution was no longer needed. And as a result of his stating um, that communism, socialism, and then communism could be achieved by peaceful means, this meant that it could be elected, and therefore that the working class should ally with other petty bourgeois forces, intellectuals, and maybe small businessmen and others. Otherwise, socialism couldn't be elected into power. And of course, this was maybe the most obvious example of revisionist, anti-Marxist doctrine that Khrushchev insisted on, and that he insisted that the world communist movement adopt. So I think that was certainly a big part of it. I'm sure there were other motives that Khrushchev had as well. I suggest in my book Khrushchev Lied at the end that and there's some evidence that Khrushchev may have been involved in some of the conspiracies of the 1930s, the anti-party conspiracies of the 1930s. Maybe that's another possible motive for Khrushchev's attack on Stalin. It's never really been properly studied. The biographies of Khrushchev that exist are basically celebrations of Khrushchev because he was so valuable to the anti-communist movement around the world. Um, they are not critical at all. They don't ask the right questions, so we really don't know. But the Khrushchev speech was a watershed of the history, world history of the 20th century. And if you wanted to remain, if a person wanted to remain in a party that was part of the world communist movement led by the Soviet Union during Khrushchev's time, you had to agree with what Khrushchev said. You had to acknowledge, you had to assent uh, to all of these attacks, all of these lies about Stalin. Of course, people did not know they were lies at the time, but you had to agree to that. And this really poisoned the communist parties of the world after Khrushchev's time. Did that answer your question at all? Well, okay. Stalin is, I say, the most famous achievements of the Soviet Union in the during the Stalin period happened before World War II, and that was the collectivization of agriculture and the the crash, very rapid industrialization of the country without foreign capital. So, um, collectivization of the agriculture is uniformly treated in the anti-communist um, research as some sort of terrible atrocity. But this is not so. There is a researcher, not a leftist, but just a very honest scholar named Mark Tauger, Tauger, who is a professor at West Virginia University in the United States, who has spent his life studying Russian and Soviet agriculture. And in his works, he shows from primary source evidence that the collectivization of agriculture was absolutely essential, and in fact was extremely beneficial. Was a very important reform, without which the Soviet Union could never have industrialized, certainly could never have defeated the Nazis, and would never have become a strong country. Um, I use Mark Tauger's research extensively, and it is normally either ignored or distorted and lied about in the anti-communist scholarship. And secondly, crashed industrialization was extremely important. The Soviet Union industrialized, became an industrial country in about 10 years. In 1931, Stalin gave a speech in which he said, the capitalist world is going to attack us. He didn't specify Germany, just the capitalists. And we have 10 years. And if we don't do it, if we don't industrialize, if we don't make up the difference between ourselves and them, we'll be crushed. And it turned out, that he was exactly right. He made the speech in 1931, and in 1941, the Germany and the fascist hordes invaded the Soviet Union. So there was a crash industrialization, which was done without foreign investment. And that is, I think that's very important to understand, that the capital for industrialization in the Soviet Union was raised by the labor of the Soviet working class and the Soviet peasantry. And they still were able to industrialize, to become a powerful industrial country. So much so, and then of course this continued during the war, so that at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union was one of the two great powers in the world. The Soviet Union went from being, let's say in 1929, to being a very poor, basically agricultural country with very primitive agricultural methods, very little industry, to by 1945 being one of the two great powers, and of course able to defeat the Nazi onslaught, which really almost nobody thought that they would be able to do. This was a tremendous achievement. And it's one of the reasons, I think, maybe it's the major reason, why there are all these attacks on Stalin and on the Soviet Union of the 1930s. Because the capitalists feel, the apologists for capitalism feel that they must make the Soviet Union look like hell on earth, because these were tremendous achievements which were admired, by millions, hundreds of millions of working people and communists all over the world. So these are the greatest achievements of the Soviet Union during the 1930s. I think everybody would agree with that.
Yes, thank you, Professor Grover. Happy anniversary to you too. Can you hear me?
Yes, and I can see you.
Happy anniversary to you too. Stalin's anniversary. Part of my.
You saw the sign, right?
Oh yes. Happy.
That's it.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for writing in our language.
Yes, of course.
Part of my questions you have already answered, though I would like to ask to answer in full that why the politician, the Western politician, including pseudo-communists, so-called communists, among others, cooked such a false narrative on Comrade Stalin, that he murdered, he slaughtered so many people, he is a dictator and all. Taking a reference that you just mentioned in Ratan Bhandari's question about the Second World War, if you take the reference that they should praise Stalin instead of criticizing him, instead of cooking such a nonsense narrative about him, that Stalin led and succeeded to stop Hitler's atrocity all over the world. And he saved Europe, among others. He saved humanity at all, at the cost of thousands and millions of Soviets that time. The people and the security forces, they sacrificed. So, is there any, hidden reason behind cooking such a nonsense, false narrative about those so-called Western politicians, scholars, so-called scholars, and even the pseudo-communists. Even in our country, they call communists, and they are anti-Stalin. They don't.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't. I mean, they don't. They say they are not anti-Stalin, but they criticize them. Stalin was 70% wrong, 90% wrong, and they just make a mathematics calculation, and they. Uh, they are impressed by the false narrative created by the West, and they are also taking the same narratives. What could be the reason for creating such thing, besides you just mentioned of the industrial revolution in Soviet Union in the leadership of Stalin? Thank you, Professor.
Well, I think I covered this in my talk, but let me just briefly state that it's ideologically very important for the capitalists uh, to smear communism uh, and therefore to lie about it. And I think some of them know they're lying. I mean, people like Stephen Kotkin, who wrote those books, he has to know that he's distorting the evidence. He doesn't have any evidence of any of these for any of these crimes. So therefore, some of the scholars know that they're lying. But most people don't know that. Most people just think that these are well-established facts. All of the experts say it. Um, and they think that the field of Soviet history is like, is like I don't know, is like maybe physics or chemistry. You believe the experts because that's their specialty, and you take for granted that they're accurate, that they are striving for the truth, and it's not the case. It's not true, but it's there, and it's repeated over and over and over again. That's the fallacy of repetition. We hear all of this from a very early age. Uh, and um, and so the vast majority of people cannot go out and verify and check the evidence. Um, that's our job. That's like my job and the job of other scholars to tell the truth. But this has been going on for you know close to 100 years now, right? This anti-communism, and especially the last 90 years or so, attacks on Stalin and on the Soviet Union. Uh, I think the influence of Khrushchev's secret speech, the influence of the turn of the Soviet Union towards what we call revisionism, anti-communism, is been very influential. Most people won't go beyond that. They're not going to go out there and look for the truth. I mean, that's my job, right? That's the job of scholarship, to go out there and try to find the truth. And I think it's going to take a lot of work on your part, on all of our parts, to um, to combat these lies about Stalin and the history of the Soviet Union during his time. It's been for so many years. These lies have been repeated over and over again from different sources that it's not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult to convince people that these are lies. So that's really why I do my research. I mean, it's interesting, it's fascinating, but I think that this is the biggest question of the biggest question facing the working class, facing exploited people in the world today, is the question of the history of the communist movement, what its successes were, um, why it went off the tracks, uh, and the Stalin period and the person of Joseph Stalin are central to that. So this is why I do my research. And as I said at the end of my talk, you have a big job to do. We all have a big job to do. We have to um, convince others. We have to, use all the facilities at our disposal to combat these lies. Because without combating these lies, we're not going to win.
Agreed. Thank you.
Okay. I get asked about this question quite a bit. I have never made a full-scale study of this issue. I can tell you that, but I've looked into it a little bit. Stalin's health was very poor. Stalin worked less and less and less all the way through the 1940s after the war. We know that because of the records of visitors to his office have been published, and he spent less and less time in his office. By 1951, and I mentioned this in my book Khrushchev Lied, which maybe you've seen. In 1951, a rubber stamp was made up so that the other members of the Politburo could use that stamp on decisions that they made. The rubber stamp was made of Stalin's signature because Stalin was so often absent. In October 1952, at the Central Committee plenum, at the Central Committee plenum, which took place right after the 19th Party Congress in October 1952, Stalin asked to be allowed to resign, to retire. And he said, "I'm sick, I'm old, I don't read papers anymore." But the audience, the members of the Central Committee, all shouted that they wanted him to continue, and so he did not resign. But he was not very active. So his health was very poor. I think it's entirely credible that he did in fact suffer a stroke on March the 1st, 1953, which was essentially the official story at the time. Now, I guess there is some question as to whether he received prompt medical attention. There is some evidence. I have not made a special study of it. There's some evidence that it was perhaps as long as 24 hours before a doctor was called. I don't know about that because I haven't verified it, but I think that's quite possible. It's also possible that Stalin would never have recovered from the stroke, even if he had had prompt medical attention. I do not personally, on the basis of what I know, I do not personally think that Stalin was murdered. However, I have not made a special study of that question. The way that story is usually told, I don't know what you've read, but the way that story is usually told, especially in the semi-popular and popular media, movies and books and so forth, is that Stalin was this really bad guy, and that Lavrenti Beria arranged to have him killed, and then Beria turned around and told the other members of the political leadership, "I've saved you all, Stalin was going to kill you all this kind of super anti-Stalin, anti-communist stuff. There's no evidence for any of that. And so I think that the question of whether Stalin was murdered, the allegation that he was murdered, is mainly used for anti-communist purposes. And I would advise you to tell others that at this point that seems to be the case and to forget about it. That's a very big question. One way of looking at it is, of course, study Soviet history, right? I think that it's important to do two things. It's not easy to do two things at once, but I think we have to do two things at once. We have to, on the one hand, we have to fight the lies about Stalin and the Soviet Union during his period. On the other hand, we have to make a thorough investigation of just why the Soviet Union turned sharply to the right after Stalin's death. One simple way of putting this is, where did Khrushchev come from? Okay, Khrushchev was a major Soviet leader during the 1930s, during Stalin's time. Okay, so that some process was going on during the Stalin period, during the 1930s, perhaps even earlier, that produced people like Khrushchev. Don't forget, it wasn't just Khrushchev. Khrushchev had a team of highly ranked political leaders who basically drafted uh, that speech, that secret speech for him. I discussed this in my book, Khrushchev Lied, and it's discussed elsewhere too. And there were all those hundreds of members of the Central Committee who listened to his talk, uh, the secret speech. And many of them must have known that Khrushchev was lying about at least some of the things he said. Perhaps none of them knew that he lied about everything, as I show in my book, but many of them must have known that he lied about much of it. And, you know, you have to wonder why that was. Um, there are indications that Stalin was becoming more and more critical of the party leadership in the post-World War II period. But I think maybe the place to start is just, how did Soviet politics change after Khrushchev's secret speech? One place to start looking, and I think it's helpful, is the what's called the Sino-Soviet dispute. I assume you know what that was. This was the ideological dispute between the Chinese Communist Party, at that time led by Mao Zedong, and the Soviet leadership at that time under Khrushchev. Started in 1957 with this document called on the differences between Comrade Togliatti and us, which was drafted by the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. They addressed their criticisms against Togliatti, who was the head of the Italian Communist Party, but they were really addressing their remarks against Khrushchev. Okay, they just didn't say that outright. And then a year or so later, they came out with another long document called "More on the Differences Between Comrade Togliatti and Us," and this developed into what is called the Sino-Soviet dispute, with an exchange of documents between the Soviet leadership and the Chinese leadership. I would say that the Chinese leadership began to see through, began to analyze the errors and ultimately the betrayal that Khrushchev and his people were committing. And by the early 1960s, the Chinese Communist Party published a pamphlet, an essay called "On Khrushchev's Phony Communism." Now, that gets us into the history of the Chinese Communist Party, and of course, that's another important issue, and I don't want to go into that now, mainly because I haven't made a special study of it. I am not saying that Mao Zedong got everything right. I think he could not possibly have gotten everything right. And as you know, after Mao's death, there were major political shifts and changes in the political line of the Chinese Communist Party. So I'm going to leave that aside. But the Chinese Communist Party started to make a special study of why Khrushchev did what he did, starting around 1957. And I think that those documents are worth studying if you want to begin to see where honest communists at that time were becoming critical of Khrushchev and Khrushchev's leadership. that having been said, I think that these two jobs, um, combating well, maybe three jobs. One is combating the lies against Stalin. Secondly, is celebrating and propagating the triumphs of the world communist movement during the Stalin period, which we've mentioned here briefly, and you know about. And then thirdly, studying where where in the post-Stalin period the Soviet Union, Communist Party of the Soviet Union went wrong. These are significant challenges to us, and of course, all the answers are not in. We don't have all of the answers. We need to continue to study. But there's no reason to be apologetic about it. The triumphs of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period were tremendous. The fact that the anti-communists and Trotskyites lie about Stalin, that they demonstrably, provably lie about him so much, is evidence that uh, that he didn't commit crimes. All these crimes they charge him are false, and that the capitalists and the Trotskyites and the phony socialists are desperate to come up with lies about Stalin because the triumphs were so spectacular. So I think what you're first of all going to run across when you deal with when you go out there to form and develop your communist movement, the first thing is that you're going to have to deal with the lies against Stalin. But let's not overlook the fact that we also have to study. Uh, we have to come to some sort of conclusions about what went wrong, where Khrushchev came from, and that's where I think starting with the documents, the Chinese documents from the Sino-Soviet disputes. I mean, they have a lot of significant, I think, significant analysis there. Certainly, this business about peaceful uh, communism, socialism can be won through peaceful coexistence, has to be rejected. You know, that was one of the great um, debates in the Second International before the First World War. That experience needs to be studied too. The Second International really fell apart over the issue of whether there could be a peaceful um, evolution towards socialism. And the countries, the socialist movements in the Second International that adopted the position that socialism could be won by the ballot box, could be won peacefully without revolution, all sided with their own capitalist classes during World War One, and that caused you know, and of course Lenin and the Bolsheviks split with that, and that was the reason for the beginning of the international communist movement as opposed to the socialist movement, which proved itself to be a rotten movement because and ultimately uh, because they believed that revolution was not necessary. I hope that that is somewhat helpful.
I want to ask the questions that what I asked first. So what I meant to ask was, we all know how badly the Khrushchev's speech affected the Soviet Union in the Soviet Union, but in the global context, we know the fall of the USSR was really a setback. But in the global context, what was the immediate impact of that speech, and how badly it directly affected, without talking about the indirect effects?
Khrushchev's speech.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, okay, the vast majority. Well, first of all, within I did look into this question some years ago. It's hard to find precise numbers, but I would say that outside of China and the Soviet Union, perhaps Eastern Europe, um, after Khrushchev's speech, within a year or two of Khrushchev's speech, something like a third of all the communists in the world quit their communist parties. That certainly happened in the United States. It happened to many, many other places too. It happened in Europe, where they had very large communist parties, Italy, France. Um, So it was a tremendous blow to the world communist movement. Secondly, um, some relatively few of these communists formed a kind of a loose international around China because of the Chinese communist leadership's criticisms of Khrushchev's revisionism. So that was part of it. But I think the major thing that happened, at least in Europe, I don't know about Asia. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the history of the communist movements in Asia outside of China. But certainly in Europe, as a result of Khrushchev's speech, the communists who remained in the communist movement adopted his position that socialism should be won by peaceful means, by the ballot box. And what that meant was retreating from support for the working class, retreating of course, from the idea of revolution, absolutely, retreating from the working class, going back to concentrating on trying to win um, elections, bourgeois elections, and we should be aware that the bourgeois electoral system can never be a vehicle for winning real working class dictatorship. Okay, that's been proven by the history of the 20th century. I think that was uh, the main result that the uh, communist movements in the West uh, turned to what is now called Euro communism. And of course, they all repeated and continued to repeat over decades after 1956 the Khrushchev era lies about Stalin. So they were going around attacking and smearing with mud their own legacy. And one more thing that happened, which is significant, I think. Uh, by 1956, the Trotskyist movement in the world was small and getting smaller, weak and getting weaker. And Khrushchev's attacks on Stalin was a completely revived the Trotskyist movement because uh, it seemed like it seemed like Trotsky had been telling the truth with all of his lies and negative statements about Stalin during the 1930s. So the Trotskyist movement got a tremendous boost, a tremendous support out of Khrushchev's speech, and started to grow everywhere. And today remains a very powerful and very negative movement on the left, pretty much everywhere. I don't know about Nepal, but pretty much everywhere. And the Trotskyist movement is based entirely on lies about Stalin. That, and of course, they uncritically repeat all of Trotsky's lies. I have 4 books in which I detail how we can prove that Trotsky lied. Trotsky lied tremendously, but the Trotskyists all believe him. So the growth and of influence within the left of the Trotskyist movement was another result of Khrushchev's secret speech. Khrushchev's secret speech was a body blow, as I said in my talk, to the world communist movement from which it never recovered. And we have to combat its result. We have to combat that result, and we have a big job ahead of us.
Thank you, Professor. So I think it's about time now. So if we have any questions, we would take it in the last question. Uh, if not, we are going to conclude. So I'd like to thank Professor, and I would like to repeat, and we are very very honored to have you. And
Thank you.
if you have any words that you want to, so we have another questions from Raghu sir. He is meaning to ask. Uh, we want to know what the RCP USA Stalin RCP USA's stand is taken on Stalin at this moment.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you said. Ask me what?
What? what the RCP USA, what stance the RCP USA has taken on Stalin at this moment?
RC,
RCP USA probably means to say Ovikian.
Yuvekins group,
Yes.
can't say anything positive. Yuvekins group is a cult around Avakian. That's the, and cults have no place in a Marxist communist movement. Okay, it's they make the cult around Trotsky. They're very much like the cult around Trotsky, except Avakian's not dead yet. The second thing is that I mean, and they're just uncritical of Avakian. The second thing is that they've really abandoned uh, the working class. 25. I'm not an expert on them, but like 20 years ago or so, they just stopped talking about the working class. Period. You know, they used to have a newspaper. I didn't read it very much, but they called the Revolutionary Worker, and they dropped the word worker. Um, they seldom say anything about the history of the world communist movement. Uh, it's a true cult. I have, I have, I do sometimes read their materials. Um, they concentrate on raising money. Uh, they are certainly not building any kind of revolutionary movement, despite what they are claiming. And you should not look to them for any kind of guidance.
So, any parting thoughts you want to say and you got it left or anything like that?
Yes, I will mail you a transcript. I will mail you the text of my talk. Okay, if you wish. Uh, if you want to, you can translate it. You can post it online. You can. I hope it's useful to you, and I hope that you will uh, tell me, send to me the link, whatever you have for this talk here. If you post it on YouTube, send me that link. If you post it somewhere else, if you only post the audio, that's okay, whatever you do. But if you do make any kind of use of it like that, please send me the link so that I can also make use of it. And I want to say again, I'm very honored and very pleased to speak to you, and I wish you all the best in your struggles for a better world there in Nepal. Thank you. I'm very glad that you invited me. I feel very honored. Thank you. Not, congratulations on the birthday, the anniversary of the birthday of Comrade Stalin. Right? Bye bye.